I don't want half-hearted love affairs. I need someone who really cares. Life is too short to play silly games. I've promised myself I won't do that again. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be worth it, yeah. Too many people take second best, but I won't take anything less. It's got to be, yeah, perfect. Young hearts are foolish. They make such mistakes. They are much too eager to give their love away. Well, I have been foolish too many times. Now I'm determined I'm gonna get it right. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be worth it, yeah. Too many people take second best, but I won't take anything less. It's got to be, yeah, perfect. Young hearts are foolish. They make such mistakes. They are much too eager to give their love away. Well, I have been foolish too many times. Now I'm determined I'm gonna get it right. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be worth it, yeah. Too many people take second best, but I won't take anything less. It's got to be, yeah, perfect. It's got salt of your tears in the middle of the rain makes me think of diamonds on your face. The color of our love is cold like the snow. What can men do against such reckless heat? Shine on,
All right, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I acknowledge the traditional owner of the land on which we held this symposium, the land of the Wurundjeri, the Woiwurrung and the Wurrung peoples, and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emergent. My name is Professor Paul Lowe. I'm the head of school of the Aberdeen School of Architecture at Bond University, and a convener of the symposium together with Leda Asangsiong and Rokus Hingle. So I'm delighted to introduce this evening's closing keynote speakers, Theodore Spyropoulos, for the Future Design Research Symposium. Now, after Theodore's lectures, talk, we will move straight into the plenary sessions, where I will invite moderators from today's sessions, Professor Helene Fouchot, Associate Professors Kate Rolon, and Associate Professors Rokus Hinkles, who come to join us on stage together with Leda Asangsiong, and we will continue discussions around the topic of design research. Now, the aim of the plenary sessions is both to discuss Theodore's presentations in terms of the design research trajectories, and also started to open up conversation and cut across the various thematic discussed in earlier sessions on creative practice research, or CPR. Through feminist First Nations narrative, co-designing, co-creations, open source, digital materiality, design synthesis, testing, prototyping, etc., that we have discussed today. Now, all this seemingly jarring and conflicting approach in design research methodology and pedagogical approach points towards how, why, and the purpose of design research. And my hope is to generate productive conversations on design research and stir up further talks that our audience and academics can take away and perhaps continue this conversation and reflections with the purpose to produce new project propositions for design research. So I think I've sensationalized enough of this plenary session, so hopefully nobody leave after Theo's lectures. So Theo is the director of the Architecture Association Design Research Lab, the AADRL in London, and resident artist at the Somerset House. He's previously chaired the AA graduate schools and was professor at the Somerset House in Frankfurt and a visiting research fellows at MIT Centers for Advanced Visual Studies. He's co-founders of experimental art, architecture, and design practice, Minimal Forms, and their work has been acquired by international art and architecture collections, including Frag Centers and the Archigram Archive, and has been exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art, Barbican Center, Moscow Taipei, Detroit Institute of Art, the Leonardo da Vinci Museum of Science and Technology in the ICA. Theo has previously worked for the Office of Peter Eisenman and Zaha Hadid and has received his PhD from the Bartlett School of Architecture. And in recognizing the excellence and contributions for education in directing the AADRL, Theo was awarded the Acadian Education Award in 2013. He's also the author of Adaptive Ecology, Correlative Systems of Living, published in 2013, Enabling, published in 2010, and the forthcoming book titled Behaviors. So I would like to welcome Theo to the stage for his keynote lecture. Thank you, Theo.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and everybody for, I think, all of the hospitality and kindness over the last couple of days. I feel quite privileged, actually, to be in a position to kind of share some of the work here and to be in the company of friends who I haven't seen in a while and be in the space to be able to kind of deliver a talk on the subject of design research. I think it resonates very close to me because in some ways it speaks to the motivation of what we mean in terms of how design can really contribute and offer something meaningful in terms of the way that we think about things. I titled the talk Towards the Certainty of Uncertainty because I think in many ways this will be self-evident that most of the work that I'm somehow involved in is always kind of unapologetically motivated with the idea that design is critical and it speaks to something that's very human. Symposium spoke about the future, but the future in some ways is a word that a colleague of mine, David Green, would say is a very 60s thing. And I think, for example, here it's a bit of a McLuhanism from my side, but I really do believe if you're interested in the future, you look to the present because we live in the past. It's more a kind of way that we think about things, and I think most of the things that are motivated by the work that I'll share is really about trying to be responsive to our time. So design research, in some sense, has to be somehow qualified, but I think it's qualified in action, and it's qualified by motivation, and a lot of the work that I'll speak to you is about really evolving a kind of attitude towards learning and developing design, experimentation, and failure. People like Gordon Pask, who is a second-order cybernetician, resonates a lot with me in particular because he spoke about a form of interaction and communication that he conceptualized as conversation theory, and he thought about that in a way to be responsive to the concepts of systems thinking, cybernetics, a whole host of concepts of adaptability and intelligence that was very much a product of engagement, of human to human, human to machine, and machine to machine. And that, in some sense, was always somehow featured within the domain of architecture, because architecture, in some sense, allowed for a very particular kind of conversation. And a lot of the work that I'm going to share today is really the product of collaborations with my students, with my staff at the DRL, with my brother, all kind of revolving around the same kind of situation similar to Jenny that presented yesterday, a kind of entanglement between the Architectural Association and my practice when both my brother and I moved back to London from New York. So in documents like this, you'll see people like John Fraser or Cedric Price, people that were talking about anticipatory architecture and trying to kind of speak to what architecture as an environment could potentially mean. So maybe certain declarations from my side can be somehow summed up in a statement by Hans Hollein, which was really a provocation of the time, that he said that everything was architecture. He said, a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of traditional building will enter the realm of architecture, as architecture and architects will enter new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture, and in some ways, I think from 2 decades sort of working in the business of all of this, I feel like if the problem is spatial, then the kind of architectural kind of impetus to it offers us a way to somehow participate in things. And this is just an image at the time, which was also sort of trying to speak about what the future of architecture could be. It was the dawn of computer art. It was the beginning of CAD systems and Boeing kind of parametric kind of aspects of things. It was really a time for, I think, thought experiments and really working without access to technology. And I think bringing about a certain form of conceptual project, which I think is very important. In the context of design research, I've spent 22 years at a place called the DRL at the AA, and I think design research, I think, is very important, but it's very much predicated, I think, in the ways that one tries to somehow ask fundamental questions. When the lab was set up, kind of social science experiments like laboratory life or the structure of scientific revolutions were kind of seminal texts that kind of played a role, and Thomas Kuhn's would say that the answers you get depend upon the questions you ask. The context of all of that stuff relative to the DRL was also in terms of questioning the relationship of technology to things. But at the same time, I think also questioning with a certain kind of openness, not to somehow absorb kind of technology as something to be foregrounded, but something to somehow be explored as a kind of new space. In the 60s and 70s, and also Adam Curtis, when he did a BBC show in 2011, took Richard Brautigan's poem, All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace, and started to speak about the relationship not only to ecology and technology, but also to the relationship of ourselves with each other. And in some sense, he also spoke to the issue that there's both social and political and the issues of labor and power, and he started to speak about a relationship of feedback and how that somehow plays a kind of critical role in the way that we sort of look at things. So in one sense, I think a lot of the aspects on what we work on, in a sense, is humanizing technology and looks at architecture as a form of resistance. It tries to situate, I think, a lot of the things that are happening within a kind of cultural paradigm that starts to look at technology as something that is both cultural, but is also something ecological. Taking Cedric Price's kind of concept of technology is the answer, but following it up very quickly by saying what was a question. So I'm going to speak of a different kind of AI, which is an architectural intelligence. And I think in some sense, architecture is speaking to, I think, the motivation of enabling people and sort of trying to construct an idea of learning that is not somehow domesticated within the realm of the university, research grants, and this kind of way. It's going to speak about something which is a lot more messy, which celebrates failure in a kind of Samuel Beckett way: fail, fail better, fail again. And we'll try to share a little bit how the context of the lab and the context of my studio somehow have a very synergetic process, at least over the last 20 years, by speaking to it as a kind of continuity of the experiment. And this was a publication at the Architectural Association by James Gowan, which was, in some sense, trying to speak to this notion of self-reflection. And I had the privilege of being in a smoke ceremony yesterday, and this concept of self-reflection in some sense resonated. At the AA, in some sense, it was really about, and I still believe it quite personally, that it should be a space for experimentation and exploring ideas. Boyarsky, riding on an elephant outside of central London, concepts of play and togetherness, the social aspect that brings people together to be motivated to explore things, I think is very important. I also should probably make a kind of declaration that I really don't believe in disciplinary distinctions, and I think projects really sort of construct, I think, what really comes together to be, I think, a way to kind of communicate and to work on complex problems. And at the AA, in some sense, I think that people will speak about constraints, or people will say the lack of things or resources, but the spirit of a place, I think, is very important. So what motivates a belief system to somehow construct an architectural practice, project, and I think purpose, I think, is very important. And I think working in Georgian terraces, I can tell you that we don't have the facilities that you have. We don't have really much, but I think one of the things that has always been inspiring to me is that people come there with a belief that somehow architecture matters. And I sometimes take that for granted, that that's what really our bigger purpose is supposed to be about, but I can say that that's not always the case. I did spend some time after I finished as a student to work in offices like Peter Eisenman's and Zaha Hadid's. And I only mentioned that in a sense that education didn't begin and end at school. It continued in the environments and the decisions that I took afterwards, and at the same time was part, I think, of an important period in my own life trying to figure out what all of this stuff was really about and how I personally can contribute. I've spent a lot of years at the AA, but I'm not 80 years old. I'm part of the old guard, but still feel young. When you start to research a lot of the things that you do, you start to really discover, I think, a history of experimentation and exploration that was really about trying to discover new things. So I mentioned somebody like Gordon Pask, who had a strong affiliation to characters at the AA that resonated with me, but likewise also had the same at MIT, in a place called the Architecture Machine Group, which was also a kind of young experiment at the time of Nicholas Negroponte when he finished school, 2 years, set up a lab in a naive way, trying to understand how, you could say CAD systems would revolutionize the role of the architect. And through that, when you start to look at the spirit of that time, experiments like Black Mountain College and other kind of characters like Victor Papernick and others, I think these are somehow, for me, part of a kind of legacy of people that were trying to somehow construct alternatives. This is the context of the DRL. It's backside of Bedford Square, a space where that we get a lot of international students that come together, but I think a space that I try to run in a very horizontal way, where education is not something that's embedded within something that I offer or my staff offers, but it's really about us all collaborating on complex problems. And in some sense, trying to utilize whatever opportunity to create something like a project. If it's an exhibition, if it's an interface, if it's a thesis, or when we had our 10th anniversary, created an exhibition with my colleagues to try to see what our students did after they finished with us. So for the first 10 years, what did our students do? What did they explore? And how did that somehow really influence the way that we saw education and the relationship to practice? Part of that, we held a competition where 2 of our graduates, it was open to all of our graduates and our current students. We did this design build project as a kind of, let's call it, after hours experiment. And in some ways started to really try to demonstrate and try to prototype a very active way of thinking about things. That, in some sense, I think representation is just that, representation. So we always are trying to find ways to prototype ideas and to construct agency and try to facilitate new forms of communication. And through that, there's a kind of active inquiry about making and thinking and trying to construct ways of kind of synergetically thinking the relationship that we have with things. So this may be a prototype with, let's say, the thematic of mobility, but what you discover here with Agatha interacting is the human kind of element that we have that is very connected to seeing kinesthetic kind of values as something lifelike. And you read and you discover people like Valentino Bradenberg and others who will speak to those things. And I think that that's one of the things that's very important is, I think, in some sense, to understand that you really don't know very much and to be open and receptive to try to be curious about how things actually operate in the world. So learning for me is not so much about pedagogy in a generic sense, and it's not so much about trying to teach somebody something, but to create a space where new tools, thinking, background of students and staff start to really have a meaningful influence in the ways that we can refactor things. And our conversations are as much with scripting and machine learning and things that we've been doing in the studio for the last 15 years. And that's lent itself, I think, to also a very particular attitude to me for architecture, which is always trying to shift the conversation of the fixity and finiteness of how we think about building as architecture, and to really start to understand the world as something that is really adaptive and evolving. And part of that kind of argumentation is also to make the argument that things themselves have their own intelligence and they operate in the world. They see the world, they operate in the world, and they have the possibility to have agency in a meaningful way. So some of the research in itself is about trying to make these kind of self-organizing systems, but to pull them out of the computer because it's too easy in some sense after 20 years working on that stuff, and to try to see, well, how do we actually put things in the world and what are possibilities to start to think about how we interact with these things themselves. So we've been looking at brain waves and trying to start to see, well, how we can invert the process instead of trying to reinforce a form of learning which is quite prevalent in AI world, making the argument that we know the outcome. We try to set up new conditions in terms of how we can start to engage and somehow participate in that learning process at times with systems with the goal of, in some sense, kind of bringing that stuff out of the computer into the world, and how do we start to constrain and construct the possibilities of an environment to allow these things to actually operate. So this is kind of like that particle system in real world. This balloon basically follows DDIM around, and in some ways starts to deal with a whole concept of a sensorial architecture that's not so much about how we feel about things, but how things themselves interact with other things. Complementary to the DRL, and I think just as important, and if not more, in some sense to me personally, has been the working relationship that I have with my brother. He's not an architect, he's an artist. He studied at Central St. Martin's, and we've always, I think, had a very particular relationship, which has, in some sense, evolved over time. And this is Stephen up here to the left, and this is our studio at Somerset House, where we have our residency. Our approach to a lot of the things that we were doing was very much in response to a kind of search space that I think was very important to us. It really didn't matter if we were working on an interface, on an object, on a building, on a robot. We felt that all of these things were, in some sense, opportunities to explore this concept of enabling that was very important to us. And in some sense, very different to maybe a lot of my colleagues, we're very slow. We want to do everything ourselves. We have no background in anything, but we want to demystify a lot of the things. And I feel, we don't code things, but we code things. We don't, nobody would look at a script that we wrote and say that this is a piece of poetry, but it's really important that it works. And I think a lot of the projects that we've been doing, I think in some ways are demonstrations. They're kind of proof of concepts of putting things in the world and trying to get information about how they operate into the world, how people are responding to them. So here we made a project called the Petting Zoo, which is these 3 robots that have a vision system sensing, some rudimentary AI to be able to graft relationships between the crowd and an individual, shifting from vision systems of blob detection to skeletal modes and so forth, and try to use our knowledge through design to be able to construct very different relationships. It's not the most complex robot, but I can say it's a very responsive one. And as this particular project was touring for about 6 years, people put it in public spaces because that was our interest, to intervene in a domain that was every day. And people were playing with that for 12 hours a day, trying to, in some sense, engage novelty, in some sense trying to understand how it works. But I think in any ways, motivated in a sense of trying to explore a sense of discovery. For us, I think a lot of the things that we worked on were more speculations of how we can explore things in very different forms, and this is when it was installed in the Barbican. So the shift from representation to the prototype, I think, is very important. And it's very important for us to use these experiments and installations as kind of opportunities to discover. Every time it's installed somewhere else, how do people interface with it? What can we learn from it? What does the robot see? Can we communicate that to the audience so that participation is active and we don't have a passive observation to something that's just kind of a dancing sculpture, but a very active engagement of participation within that. The process to these kind of projects is never linear, and it's always sometimes working through the bad project first, working through the thing that's the most accessible or maybe sometimes the easiest to kind of work on. But then sort of discovering that basically all of that stuff is never fit for purpose, so throwing that all in the garbage and starting again. And that Beckett kind of quote of fail, fail better, fail again, all of this kind of stuff is very important within the scheme of a design research kind of paradigm. And I think it's very antithetical to the way that we deal with research in a university setting, so maybe that's something that may be helpful when one tries to actually really see how we are going to be responsive, I think, to a very, very radical period of time. And so these installations and so forth for me and my brother have always been mechanisms to learn and really to observe and kind of go back into the studio and try to synthesize things. And a lot of them, I have to say, have always been almost self-generated. Even if we were given an opportunity to do something somewhere, usually that comes with a certain ignorance to the idea of how long it takes to actually do these things. So I think what's important is, I think, to really try to see it as a kind of continuous project that evolves almost daily. And we have this relationship. The petting zoo was a project that we did right after a project called the Memory Cloud, which we performed in London. And at the time that the performance was about to take place, the London Telegraph came out with this headline, which it said, "The Memory Cloud, potentially one of the most dramatic and most obscene art events ever to be held in London," which is a kind of interesting quote to have to live up to, or to pacify basically everybody at a moment in time where we had a lot of religious intolerance. We had to give certain kind of satisfactory responses in terms of how we would deal with issues of riot. It took us a year and a half to actually do a performance that lasted 2.5 hours each day for 3 days. And in the process of figuring that out, we also figured out that it was only the third time that artists were actually given, let's say, Trafalgar Square as a canvas. And one artist that I worked quite closely with, Krzysztof Wodicko, was one of those artists who, at the time, was responding to the South African embassy. But for us, that space was always a very important space, and sometimes place creates the apparatus to really respond. We didn't have a project that we installed here. We just had a project that was motivated by trying to create a voice for people to speak, and we had a certain kind of attitude towards the public, and the public space as sort of being the host of that conversation. So Trafalgar Square has always been a space for celebration and protest, and in some sense that served us to basically communicate to the ICA in London that what we wanted to do was animate the built environment through conversation, and that was basically all we had. No images. This was intentionality first and foremost, but we had a certain kind of approach which we said we would hybridize one of the oldest forms of technology, like smoke signals, with SMS, which were like a personal interface that would allow people to communicate. And we wanted, in a similar way to Krzysztof, to make monuments communicate, but actually we wanted the space of Trafalgar Square to be a space that's occupied not through entertainment, but through expression, a way of kind of collectively writing space. And we had the opportunity of also performing this a couple of years later in the city of Detroit, and you understand that these ideas of writing space, or what we were calling, was testimonials of people that were projecting things that were sometimes not easily being able to be expressed in other forms, and bringing them together with people in a kind of shared environment. And the resonance of projects like this, I think, are also important. We were interested in constructing atmospheres. We were interested in all of this kind of stuff. After the event itself, we received a very nice letter about 8 months after we performed it, that the city of Detroit, a lot of the art institutes that helped us put on the piece, decided that they were going to support something called de-electricity, which is a light biennial, taking the concept that we had as the city as canvas as basically the conceptual apparatus to invite artists, both local and international, to communicate. And I can say that this is still going on. And something like the Detroit Institute of Arts, which front entrance of this very civic building is locked, a city that has obviously a lot of issues, but also has an amazing sense of pride and community. I think now when you start to look at what's been happening with this, I think in many ways, I think it opens up the possibilities that every intervention has the possibilities to have a meaningful influence. And within our work, it doesn't matter if it's a performance like this piece called Becoming Animal, or if we're exploring technologies like sand printing and trying to generate high-resolution kind of concepts for furniture, outdoor furniture, things like this. There's a certain sense that every project is an opportunity to kind of test the limits and to push things. And every project, in some sense, no matter its ability to be literally interactive or somehow much more sensorially explored, can be opportunities to really start to fold in a very different idea of complexity. And I'm not talking about the complexity of form, but I'm talking about the ways that things operate, self-regulate. Like for this competition in Korea, we wanted the building to be naturally lit, and almost in a similar way to this one. Naturally ventilated, so used a lot of our kinesthetic approaches to develop a kind of self-regulatory system for this kind of hybrid skin. We work in a lot of kind of cultural and public projects. One project that we've been working on for quite some time has been for Athens' first national park, which has been master planned by Renzo Piano, and we've talked about concepts of electric gardens and trying to somehow develop kind of strategies and peer structures that are somehow giving over the opportunity for people to kind of explore the place a bit more. We explore things like textiles, trying to think about a deployable architecture, kind of like an architecture that you can take with you. So we take very everyday materials like lycra, and we try to look at what we can do with these kind of soft casting systems and kind of explore that in a way that we can start to think about the differences between compacted earth, concrete, how temporal buildings and lightweight systems could actually have semi-permanent or permanent strategies. And we use art in some ways as mechanisms to be able to test that. So this project we call Endless Forms Most Beautiful is a strategy of just allowing materiality to somehow self-form. In parallel to all of these things, I think we live in a world very much dominated by computational frameworks. It's the kind of back end to almost all forms of interaction today. When we realize that language somehow defeats the purpose of communication at times, it's recognizing the limits of that. And if we look to art, for example, Joseph Kosuth spoke about some of the challenges of this in this piece, which is called like 1-3 chairs. And he spoke to the fact that all of these things fulfill what we would somehow define as chair. The definition of chair fulfills its role, the representation of a chair and the object, all in some sense are somehow equal but radically different. And today we may live in a world similar to Raffaello De Andrea's project, where we never consider that the chair itself may have its own agency, may I have degrees of understanding its chairness, and try to operate in a world in some sense that's also trying to define itself in its own search space. So in architecture in particular, where robotics is somehow dominated with a concept of a kind of industrial production past, a lot of the things that I've been exploring, both with Stephen and with my students, have been in some sense trying to open up and to problematize agency and constructing agency, and to really be conscious and aware of how things themselves would, in that world, have their own capacity to understand that world. Taking a very kind of radical constructivist approach to it, which basically says your observation of the world is your own. And that means that it's inaccessible to others. And what foregrounds communication is really in the ways that we sort of try and attempt to communicate. And this is where conversation theory for me resonates. But these technologies are so everyday that we never really think about them. But in some sense, they potentially could liberate a very different idea of what it would mean for a building itself to actually have no blueprint or a master plan. When I wrote the book Adaptive Ecologies, which was a book on urbanism, it was a recognition that no master plan had really truly ever been realized, and that's a good thing. And it's the attempt to actually think that the master plan or the blueprint is actually this illusion of control that we think we have. So if we liberate ourselves from that, and we start to think about things themselves having the capacity to move, to reconstruct, to collectively almost self-organize in ways that social insects do and others, we start to open up a territory of exploration which starts to challenge, I think, all the orthodoxies that have been inherited about what actually buildings are, what a brick is. You know, I'm not sure what Lu Kan would say about this, but I think the reality of that stuff is starts to make the argument of a resolution space. It starts to speak about digital materiality, starts to talk about the aspects of all of these technologies now that are with us and much more available, which is a radical difference from the 60s and 70s. They didn't have the stuff to play with. And the concept of having things, I think in some sense, is really to open up the possibility that simple things like illumination can be communication, but could also have very different kinds of use cases. And that has also started to talk a lot about organizations and taxonomies and start to really speak to, I think, something that's very different. This is a prototype that we've been working on with my students, trying to basically build a kind of adaptive spring. And you realize as an individual, one of these kind of agents could basically roll and curl. When we start to think about the role of these kind of digital playpens, we start to explore the possibilities of what collaboration or communication could potentially mean. And things, very simple things like a sidewalk and negotiating the terrain of the everyday become conceptual problems that become very explicit, in some sense, able to be worked on. As an individual, not possible. Meet two friends, now you have tripod behavior, you can walk, and you can basically step over things. This kind of thing also speaks about the fact that it's by necessity that systems have to evolve over time. And I think that this is a very important thing, because systems themselves, I think, for them to truly, really participate, have to have their own agency. And this isn't really like some military perspective to things. This is really about the idea that they need to try to understand their environments just like we do, in some sense. So a brick in this case, using voxel-like strategies, could take the form of anything. It has nothing to do with style, shape. Everything is in formation, and everything has to be negotiated in terms of any form of interaction. So movement, ability to create space, the ability to create architecture, but you could sort of discover a kind of architecture that could continuously change with you. And I think that this has, in some sense, been, I think, an important way to conceptualize maybe new terrains for what architecture could be, instead of reinforcing what mostly has been inherited as should be. So a lot of the things that we do digitally, we spend a lot of time and agonize over trying to make them real. And that, in some sense, is a kind of testimony in terms of proof of concept and a commitment to try to discover. And that leverages, I think, everything. It doesn't have the orthodoxy of one workflow. It means that you move into very, very different disciplines, and in some sense, you're moving into that discipline with the idea of trying to learn, not necessarily just try to collaborate with an engineer in some sense that will make the stuff for you. Sorry, this one isn't working. And that also comes with really working with everything and nothing at the same time. So a piece of MDF, by patterning it, you introduce plasticity. You introduce ways of thinking about how one element will communicate with another one. How do these cubes communicate? How would they self-construct? How do you develop something that's responsive to the population? If I have 100 cubes, what can I do? You think about things as goals that are in some sense not achievable. There's no optimized way of doing things because that's not how things work in the world. And in some ways you try to move within different ways of thinking about how things can be actuated, from much more mechanical to much more soft body kind of strategies, or even the biological. But what's an attempt of sort of challenging, I think, some of the things that we've kind of inherited. People like John Fraser talked about evolutionary algorithms, and you could have any shape of a column, any height. But going back to DeAndrea's concept, even something like a column would never be explicitly communicated to these things, but a target of height, one trajectory, could be something to be described. The goal of making something is something that's evolving and, in some sense, really about the interaction of things, something that's very time-based and situated. I think architecture in some ways can manifest this in ways that other practices can't. And in some sense, I think a lot of this starts to also open up new opportunities to think about things. If you have this population and it's deployed, how we can start to think about ways to deal with the aspects of redundancy. How can every, let's say, building block or voxel in this world, develop the approach to actually understand itself relative to others. And so, for example, this architecture was conceptualized to actually have all the rules be designed so that there was no need for, let's say, scaffolding. And at one stage of organization, that would be reevaluated, and with here, for example, having some structural kind of optimization pathways being defined algorithmically so that we knew which of the voxels were important for the integrity of the structure and which of them could move. And so that puts more of these things then back at play to create space in some sense. That research has been evolving over the last 10, 15 years, and with that, also the purpose of what some of these things could be. And I think when we start to think about architecture that's not fixed, and we start to recognize how many people are literally on the move, we start to think about scenarios which are very everyday, but we don't talk about, that demand, I think, a radical different approach to thinking about creating space, and that tries to leverage things like, we were looking at post-disaster scenarios and we thought, if we could use the actuation of dropping as a mechanism for actuating, then we don't actually have to have this kind of mechanisms on site. During COVID, we were very limited to test things, but our apartment became a deployable moment to test some of these prototypes that were being built in the kitchen. And we tried in many ways to also leverage and hack existing information. People speak about data, but you can make data out of anything. The issue is how do you mine that for meaningful kind of simplification of complexity without sort of dumbing down the problem. And in some sense, models for possibilities of what architecture could be somehow remain in very different domains, like contemporary factory designs that are optimizing every inch of a space or every millimeter of space, where these kind of concepts are very much the part of these kind of real-time sourcing, sensing kind of things that continuously self-organize, like the Amazon warehouse or any of these things. And you start to realize that the things themselves demand a lot of the same challenges like we had with a petting zoo, a vision system, a mapping system, an understanding of what things do. And we started to kind of evolve some of these things, trying to take on board things like Shigeru Ban would be doing with, sticks and paper tubes and things like that. And we said, well, how could we do this in a kind of self-actuated way? What are the strategies that we could use in a way that deals with sites that are unknown to us? And how can we sort of leverage computation in a way to create the pathways for that? Trying to very actively kind of map and to test and to use the digital versioning as a way to think about how some of these spaces could be self-organized. And in a way, I think, trying to continue a legacy of things like, Shigeru Ban's interests and others, but also recognize, challenges. So for example, infrastructure failure, how do you negotiate that? And this is where the self-organizational aspects that we were learning from NSEX have value in a way that we can deal with the collaborative ways to negotiate things without over-designing everything. In the spirit of a lot of that stuff, you realize that there are kind of strands and connections to your interests that lead you to pathways of a lot of other projects. And Yona Friedman, very recently, we just had an exhibition that came down in France, in the city of Beauvais. Yona Friedman has passed away a couple of years ago, and this was the first attempt to kind of communicate his work between 4 museums. Friedman also was an influential character with Negroponte at the Architecture Machine Group when they were trying to develop maybe more adaptive concepts of urbanism. These opportunities sometimes to communicate in different kinds of times, I think, is very important. This is just a picture of the museum, and if you know the work of Yona Friedman, he does these like space frames hovering over the city of Paris. He was known as a kind of revolutionary in the art and architecture world and really believed in kind of participatory strategies of self-building. He also was somebody who believed in complexity and also spoke to ecology at a time where he, I think, put forward some quite radical ideas that are not necessarily so known to his work, because over time, sometimes I think we become, in the reflection of others, a kind of caricature of a thing, rather than looking at holistically what a body of work has contributed to stuff. But he had a series of projects. One of them that was very important to us when we were asked to kind of respond to his work was a project called Flat Rider. And if you know the Osaka Expo, this was a project that was a real project about reconfigurable partitions that people could move and somehow create space. And his legacy has always been about exploring basically the square and the circle, using it as a kind of framing device. But he also had these drawings which he had no real descriptions of, which were these kind of vector field drawings or flow field drawings. And when we did adaptive ecologies, conversations that I had that were very meaningful was with a man named John Henry Holland, who's the father of evolutionary algorithmic design processes. And he is also the father of what was known as adaptive systems at the time, which was a very kind of conceptual attitude towards computation, but very much applied to problems like traffic, like in Singapore and others. So he's one of the fathers of kind of complexity computation. And we were looking at the work of John Conway, developed the strategies of game of life, and we tried to think about how we could contribute to this concept of Yona Friedman by introducing the concept of resolution and develop these kind of installations as ways of somehow exploring some of that space by thinking of the city, building on this concept of the emotive city that we had developed for Nesta as part of an idea of thinking about what the future of the machine would be. And these kind of pieces themselves were really constructions. These are the projects that we've been working on most recently, where each one of these voxels in some sense is speaking to a shift between the square to the cube and the circle to the sphere, and to look at these organizational logics of cellular automata in some ways that algorithmically were used as ways to potentially describe everything. Stephen Wolfram basically says that that is basically the codex for almost everything. And in some ways that somehow migrates between the biological, the ecological, and the algorithmic. And here, for example, this resolution space basically was trying to construct this idea that scale is also something that's relational. The sphere and the cube maintain their relationships regardless of how big something is. And at some moment in time, it was also a kind of acknowledgement of the ways that these kind of systems are used to describe things that are inaccessible. And I think that that became very interesting, and this particular piece took its title, The Order of Time, by a book of Carlo Rovelli, who basically also says that time is a very human construction. In physics, time doesn't exist, you know, in some sense, in the way that we would express it like past and future. It's a concept that actually is meaningless in some ways. And you can start to see through these kind of ideas of recursion that, you know, the spheres then start to bring back the cube, and the issues of the perceptual kind of scanning and this idea of zooming in and zooming out, like a kind of powers of 10 kind of concept of the Eames, I think is very important. But what was important as a model for urbanism and architecture is that these could be the building blocks of an apartment, or it can be the city itself. The idea to sort of create a conceptual apparatus that says everything, like in the game of life, has influence, but no one has control. And I think that this was something that for us is a very important kind of statement of purpose, because in some sense it challenges, I think, the way that we think about a very, very top-down way of thinking about infrastructure and architecture and the relationship of these things, and starts to problematize, I think, something other. And the idea of versioning was something really just to give an idea of possibilities, with the idea that the world as you see it in a constructivist place is your own invention. I'm going to wrap up with some projects that have been a kind of long-standing project at the moment, which is where we have our residency in Somerset House. We were asked to basically construct an installation or a piece of sculpture that would speak to basically a cultural center that's taking over a former tax office in London and becoming a space for artists. So our 6-year kind of participation in Somerset House was, in some sense, to pilot this kind of initiative, to kind of keep culture in London by basically making it an artist's workspace. The piece itself, though, was given a brief to communicate the intentionality of Somerset House to the general public and the public square, and to have the public somehow project themselves to the institution. So we came up with this project called Oven in the World, which we thought that the project itself should be kind of conceptualized by playing to this idea that literally everything that one sees is actually literally their own. Using glass and thinking about a lot of the things that we were working on with these high resolution, almost cosmological kind of ideas of population and digital versioning, and looking at the optics and the refractions and the scaling down and magnification as something that could speak to a sculpture itself, that everywhere you look, you basically can never look beyond one kind of sphere or one world. Through each of those, it becomes a lens of mapping of everything that's around it, the literal environment, the people, but also the other spheres that you see. And the attempt of it was to actually move away from any form of representation and to try to build this kind of crystalline strategy. So I thought I would just share a couple of the working models of a 1500 spherical kind of headache for me and my brother now for the last 4 years. But the attempt of going from something like a conceptual rendering into starting to work with a material like glass, which is amazingly unforgiving, and to try to do that with, I think, a series of constraints. This is one of our prototypes, which is part of the glass lens. This is at quarter scale. And glass doesn't sort of scale up in scale with weight that's equivalent, so the cosmological thing became very practical in terms of nodes, almost these kind of solar systems between relationships, and the piece itself is 3 offsets of these kind of constellations, the so-called structural nodes, which are the largest spheres. They have a constellation of 2 other size spheres that are basically revolving around it, trying to normalize the weight. And this is building on a legacy of Buckminster Fuller and all of that stuff. But as soon as you introduce a hole, all of that Bucky stuff just completely falls apart. So it's something that you have to think about your work in a form of trying to invent a new way of somehow dealing with this. And because maybe, I don't know if this is a kind of autobiographical piece at the time in my life with my brother, we tried in every way to start to challenge everything that we learned by trying to explore materiality, which we were drilling spheres. We didn't even know how to do that. We YouTubed everything, can't find anything on it. We literally set up jigs to start to drill things, building aquariums with drill pieces and everything that you really shouldn't do in a health and safety way. but in an attempt to really gain access to a lot of the stuff that, in some sense, was very elusive. And through it, I think, by making things, you also start to really find out, I think, opportunities for something very different. How do you lift this thing? How do you build it? How do you put nodes up? And everything from the crate that we were designing became an opportunity, and a necessary opportunity to actually develop a strategy for building this stuff. So this drawing is a little bit of a secret, but I'm showing it to you because why not? I don't think you guys are going to try to attempt this, and if you do, more power to you. But these star shapes, using hexagons and pentagons, you use these closed forms, you think, in a logical way that this is how this thing should be assembled. But we managed to, we didn't manage, we couldn't figure out how to do this. We stopped working with engineers for a good 2-year period until we built all the models ourselves, because everything was to be value engineered and it should be a different material. To discover, I think, different patterns of assembly. At the end of the day, they're star-shaped, and they have very few elements that are not already prefabricated in a sense. The crate is actually what the contractors will lift into place. So designing the crate for shipping, which was the reason of just like moving this somewhere else, became really the piece that kind of unlocked everything. Working with companies just to see like, how big could you make a sphere? How heavy is it? And can I hold it? And I could not hold that. Became very important, because all of this kind of stuff, when you're in the business of trying to realize ideas, becomes so impactful and force you to rethink everything again, that this kind of attitude towards making, I think, is really important, and I think something that I think is becoming a bit of a lost art. I'll literally end with a different form of technology, which is not so much about interactive elements, but something that I will make the argument that phenomenon is a form of technology, the environment is a form of technology, and we've been exploring for the last 3 years concept of the elemental, but it's something radically different than, let's call it, the canons of architectural elements. Trying to look at earth, water, wind, trying to respond to this idea of the so-called environmental and ecological, and trying to discover how we can think about these, capacities to sustain life and what that really means. And that's kind of led us down the path where, watching just some water and some food coloring, but in an anti-gravity chamber in NASA, becomes really powerful for us. It's just like, wow, how can we think about stuff like that? But also reverting to projects that were kind of moments where people came together. This is Claude Perrant, working with Yves Klein, when they decided that wouldn't it be possible to just think about this kind of atmosphere of architecture, of just fire and air, and things that people like Philip Brahm talk about but don't do, and things that I think in many ways we have samples of some of this. So the concept of water in this case is the one that I just pulled out to talk about. We have things like the Blur building of Diller and Scofidio, Gaetano Pesce, talking about ice buildings. We have the research of people like Hans Ziesler, who was looking at textiles in a similar way that we are, but looking to basically freeze them into form and to use temperature and phase change as something. You have much more contemporary water harvesting systems. But we wanted to kind of think about the challenge of infrastructure and what that would mean in terms of thinking about, the idea, could we control a cloud? Could we construct an atmosphere? Could we use a concept of the weather system as being something that could actually be a water management strategy in terms of trying to create the conditions that basically extract water? And that sort of led us down the path where the way that we thought about computation, the way that we thought about our experiments were always very partial moments in a much more kind of challenging notion about what complexity is, what are times, what are the variables like temperature, phase change, how to sort of basically extract these things, and to challenge, I think, some of the historical kind of references, which are basically using like big thick walls that are cool and hot walls on the outside and capturing some stuff in a way to really start to think about literally how do clouds work, what's water vapor, how do we extract stuff, how can we set up experiments to use simulation as a process not of representation but a process to try to set up experiments. So experiment to your left is really just looking at some very simple temperature, like controlling the temperature of one sphere and using kind of water vapor and starting to see the patterns of how it starts to influence the field. Things that we would do digitally very easily, but physically trying to somehow replicate some of that in a kind of 2.5D way. And to also try to use a lot of the environmental tools as a way to start to shape the conversation about that. More in the process of discovery than suggesting that we got it all figured out, but trying to set up a pathway for, I would call design research that will look at the territory of the next 3 or 4 years worth of work to somehow discover that. And trying to understand like these concepts that you may have heard of over the last 10 years, like smart dust or other things, as being kind of ways that people were using different ways to gain information. We tried to explore that in a way that started to kind of shape some of that stuff. So this is all work in progress. But the important part about it is I think it starts to reconceptualize our approach to how we think about infrastructure and environment and how these agents themselves, what's an active and a passive system, how do these things start to really operate within an existing kind of environmental ecosystem. And there is no such thing as a ground in this context. Every space is four-dimensional. And in some ways, even problematizing that from a place where you can understand starts to become something that's very interesting, powerful, challenging, and leaves you always trying to understand a little bit more. Another project is the complete opposite. We were looking at trying to use things, very common materials that are, in some sense, very problematic in certain parts of the world, like desertification and all of these kind of things, and to try to think of ways of thinking about how we could operate within that kind of environment. And we discovered, or my students actually discovered, a very funny YouTube video, which wasn't very funny actually. It was just a lightning storm in the desert. And well, basically, you can imagine lightning striking, and in some sense, the heat of that melting the sand, and you had this almost like inverted kind of tree that's buried in the sand. And these things, in some ways, are almost like models of like termite mounds and things like that. Very strange, immediate, instant formations. Well, we try to just replicate that stuff, and this is where maybe health and safety also comes into play again, like literally welding sand, and trying to talk to our workshop that we wanted in a form of technology like others have explored, like a man named Marcus Kaiser at the Royal College of Art who did a project called solar centering, basically took a big magnifying glass and tried to develop a 3D printer. He went to Neri Oxman's basically lab, mediated matter, and worked with a colleague of ours from the DRL and Zaha's to basically do that liquid glass printing structure. There were a series of these things, but we all thought that it was still in the domain of the bounded box. And how could we develop a strategy really to break the box, but also to think about how we could start to explore the fusion of landscape and the changing of these dynamic fields by interpreting the desert as a particle system, and actually what we're doing are just trying to slow down certain particles and in a way to try to shape maybe a different kind of form of a boundary or a territory by trying to really look at the dynamics of these kind of shifting landscapes. These are all kind of very simple experiment, not so simple, but anyway, instantaneous architecture in some sense, but this is happening at the moment where we've started to try to find ways of petrifying this and trying to find a way of thinking about printing in a radically different way, where you're using the landscape in a land-forming strategy, where the thickness of a particular surface can be, millimeters thick because of the grain that you're working with of sand, and that the idea of deposition, sedimentation, all of these things that are happening very naturally and kind of like, let's call it more phenomenon-driven kind of formations could somehow be opportunistically explored as sort of strategies. And you can see some of the models that actually we've been working on now as a kind of concept for it. And, you know, if you're interested in this work, you know, this is also in process kind of work that we're doing. And, you know, our lab and everything that we do, at least from my perspective, as soon as I took over it, for the last 17 years, has always tried to make everything that we do shared and public. All the juries available for people to see the conversations as much as the work itself, in an attempt, I think, to actually make things accessible, but also to have conversations with other like-minded people. I don't take it for granted when we talk about education and learning that that's not necessarily always made available to people for very different reasons. And I think we do have a responsibility as educators to really make the effort to communicate and to invite people to be exposed to things, but also to contribute and feel like we can demystify some of the stuff. Not everything works, not everything is smart, but I think the purpose to just bring this and bookend it to a close is really about what motivates us to come together and how do we collectively respond to the challenges ahead. So as I'm losing my voice anyway, I'm going to leave you with my last slide, which is also a reminder about future. And this was the title of a lecture that Wolf Prix gave at the AA, and I felt it really summarized almost everything. And so I use it, and I hope he doesn't mind. 2 days tomorrow will be yesterday. And so I think what we're having a conversation of today, tomorrow, we have to be open to the process that it may not matter or it may change. So the concept of the certainty of uncertainty, I think, has been validated if we somehow open ourselves up to the process of trying to really collectively come together and work on things. I should say that the DRL and my office is really collaborative spaces. We work together. Ideas matter. Vision is not a dirty word. And design, I think, unapologetically is a part of everything that we do. But unfortunately, these days, very few people have the courage to actually hold themselves accountable to that process. So I'm completely unapologetic of telling you that design matters, design education is important, design research is specifically, I think, a mechanism to somehow bridge, I think, that conversation that I wanted to at least open up of interdisciplinarity. This is not something that can be institutionalized. This is more about speaking in a very honest way and collaborating with people that may have something to offer and may resonate with them, and usually these things come from structures outside of the ones that we somehow occupy. So with that, I thank you for the invitation. I hope there was something positive to come away with, and yeah, I'll open it up to conversations in the panel like Paul mentioned, so thanks.
Thank you, Theo. Can I now invite all the moderators from this afternoon, Helen Fouchot, Rocket Hingis, and Kate Trelone, thank you, and Leda as well, and Theo. So as we let Theo rest his voice, would we be able to put on the QR code? And if you have any questions, please post them on the Slidos, and I will try to weave them into the conversations. I will try to be subtle. I won't be pointing names. I won't be telling you to speak, but I will try to weave them in as much as we can, and hopefully we will have a rather smooth conversation. So the purpose of this planetary sessions is so that we can also partly to kind of look at what Theo has presented in terms of the body of work on design research and the trajectories of it, and also started to weave in some of the content and provocation that's coming out from this afternoon session and this morning sessions as well. So, okay. If you will excuse me, I'm going to have a slightly longish kind of introduction. I'll let so Theo, you can rest your voice a little bit. Okay, so thank you, Theo, for really kind of a very provocative, thought-provocative and generous talk on your work and also the work on the Design Research Lab at AA. Now, there's a kind of a real interesting search for material intelligence in your work, and both kind of as an architectural and also kind of a spatial intelligence that I thought that was really interesting, and they kind of point towards a kind of a sensorial experience as spaces as a form of experience. Now, well, from the outside, those of us who are kind of unfamiliar with the Design Research Lab, the research from the laboratory can always seem as very self-obsessed, very esoteric. And what I think you have done with your lectures, with your talk, and with a project is to start to demonstrate how once you started to bring it out of the laboratory, it become something that has an impact, that has be able to, so socially we can engage with, but also still deal with issues around memory and inhabitations. This afternoon, we already talked about this role of design research and wide topics around that. We discussed the questions around potential implication of using technologies in design educations, how students learn through making in focus panels. We talk about design research, what is innovations in culture, kind of talk, in case sessions. Culture talk about it being defined as being useful and novelty. And we also talk about what is research. Naomi Stakes points out that it's defined as acquiring new knowledge, and that has to be presented. And we also talk about, through Helene's sessions, around what is the difference between creative practice research and creative practice. So I think to set the tone for these sessions, I was hoping that we can turn to works in the next half hour, 45 minutes, with later to talk about the consequences of this sort of discussions. In other words, we want to really kind of drill a little bit deeper into the impact of creative practice research on both educations and also on practice. Yesterday we have sessions already on practice and industry, so I'd like to bring some of those thought process in. So maybe, Theo, we can start you off first, and then perhaps I can then ask Helene and Kate and Rokus to kind of jump in, and hopefully we have a much more lively conversation. So I think what you have shown, Theo, in the work is the role of research is kind of a very kind of a deep inspections of informations and also kind of the context. And there's a sense of kind of almost misuse or adaptation of data, of systems, and it's kind of this sort of mischievousness that in the DRL that sometimes people almost dismiss as kind of something serious, but actually something playful. And in a way, it's kind of linked quite nicely with what Helene's panel this afternoon, Lillian's Chi, and also Anna Miyaki was talking about in terms of intuitions, this idea of experimentations and play. I'm wondering whether, Theo, you can probably expand a little bit around that, because it's certainly not a traditional form of research. And I think that perhaps, I think if you can expand a little bit on that sort of methodologies for us.
Okay. There's a lot there, Paul. Thanks for that. I think it's very important to understand that research, in some sense, I speak to motivation, and maybe I speak to it in a positive way, but there are a lot of forces that shape research in other forms. And when you say about so-called misuse, I see the role of the artist, the architect, to have, I think, a certain kind of social responsibility, and also to be that friction. I'm not sure what creative practice means, but I know what creative friction means to me, and that means a form of resistance to the kind of orthodoxy and acceptance of things. Because we live in a time where everything is somehow mystified. And I think people utilize this kind of age of distraction to somehow escape, I think, very fundamental questions of what it means to be human. How do we relate to each other? How do we relate to our environment? And I think we've become very academic and very specialized and very assured, self-assured. And I feel that historically, if you look at things, you will always see them as a history of failure. I mean, everybody that I've talked to and I've shared today was always spoken about of the things they didn't do. But when you start to see it as a continuity of ideas, I think it's a very enabling and empowering thing that those problems haven't changed. You know, Victor Papernak was talking about the environment and what it means to design for the real world. Buckminster Fuller was working on ecologies and all of these things, and a holistic attitude towards design, that every project, from a map to a toilet, was just as valuable as any other project. And so I think it's really about really trying to create a form of criticality that doesn't reserve itself to discourse, because there is a limit of language. And I think that that is very self-evident, not just in communication, but I think when we speak about practice, I think we all have to qualify what that means for us. The starting point of the conversation of research, I think, is also to communicate its intentionality and how one chooses to work on it. And that's where design research, I think, is really about search. I would call it design search if we had to qualify it in a different way, because I think if it falls within the assurances of what, you know, everyday research is qualified in grant proposals and things like that, there isn't a real accountability on the deliverability of its impact. Or if it is, it's always with a time frame that somehow removes itself from the challenges of actually trying to find out how do you operate and participate in a world. So I just find we sometimes don't always have the means to work on something, but if the intention is good, we find a way. So it may not be, you know, the best way, but it's definitely not a right or a wrong way. You know, it's something that I think is very much about how you motivate yourself and the context of community to mobilize around certain complex problems.
Great, thank you. Helene, can I ask you to perhaps reflect on what Theo was saying, and in terms of what you were discussing earlier today on creative practice research, this notion of boundary, that there's kind of no strict boundaries between research and disciplines, and how we can also cross it and transverse it.
For sure. No, I was noting, Theo, especially how you stressed the point that you don't believe in disciplinary silos per se, that disciplinary distinctions are perhaps unhelpful, which is a stance that I usually take, but it did also lead me to reflect on the fact of how privileged I might be to take that stance. You know, I was disciplined first as an architect, and then I was redisciplined in philosophy. And in fact, it's a privilege of those 2 points of disciplination that I'm now able to venture a position or a performance or a practice of indisciplination. So I'm wondering how much, in order to critique a system or to perform, you know, indisciplination, which is my preferred term, not to be undisciplined, but indisciplined in real critical relation to how you've been formed and disciplined previously, how that still depends on your upbringing in a way. So this question of boundedness or, you know, the interstices or the liminal zones that we were hearing about earlier in one of the panels between Lisa Grocott and Black Douglas, and I've forgotten the third speaker's name, become really interesting because you can't do anything amidst total unboundedness. There's got to be some sense of, you know, the sphere's bounded relative to its fellow sphere, for instance, for some action to take place. And yet it is in those spaces of allowance between otherwise bounded objects, things, subjects, nation states that something begins to happen. So these were the reflections I was having, I suppose, on that front. But I also just want to add, it has been a remarkably phenomenal day, because we've travelled from one end of the day to the other, from, you know, Indigenous design knowledges, this idea of following the slowest learner so we can work together as a group and really collaborate. And at the other end of the day, we're venturing this kind of, I mean, you probably don't want to call it cybernetic architectures, but the obvious crucial importance of the foundation of a cybernetic thinking for you, where the environment itself is a sort of, be conceptualized as a technological system. And I'd be really fascinated to know how we bring the beginning of the day in contact with the end of the day, whether there's something in the Indigenous cosmologies, and of course I probably don't have anyone who's an expert on the panel who can answer this question for me and join the beginning of the day with the end, that connect up with some of the thinkings that are, you know, hooked up into first or second order cybernetics, and how you've picked up on some of those sort of threads in your work. Not a question with an answer, probably.
I mean, I would kind of pick it up from the perspective that usually cybernetics is usually tasked with a certain understanding of control, but from my perspective, control is an illusion. So I try to communicate a kind of Pasquian idea, because he relied on a concept of conversation as being the mechanism, which is really predicated on our ability to communicate. And the conversation theory for me was always very powerful, because it had very primary human and very relatable features to it, which it can start from anything, but we definitely know that it doesn't, you know, it's not, it can start from anywhere, and we know that it can conclude whenever that communication somehow resolves itself or doesn't. So it's something that is, as long as it's motivated, it continues. If it needs to change the subject, it can move seamlessly, but it's an agreement. Otherwise, I'm just talking with myself kind of thing, and it's possible that I do that once in a while. But the reality of the thing is that it's really trying to construct a framework for that conversation. That's where I think architecture is a very powerful way of thinking that doesn't rely on other ways and other disciplines to kind of offer its ability to participate in complex problems, which I have to say is very different from a lot of the colleagues that I sometimes participate with, which have a very deep reliance on disciplinary knowledge, philosophy, for example, or others that somehow have to impact on the methods and the means that we use to speak about, work on the project, or even problematize it. So it's more a certain kind of awareness in my own work that I've learned a lot more from other people by constructing a framework that allows them to participate and enable them to feel not that they have through habit to respond in a way that somehow has been taught, but is something more about discovery and curiosity. So I think if, in my case, and you use the word privilege, I've been privileged, I think, in many, many different ways, but that has always, I think, come from the generosity of the people that I've met and the environments that I've had to engage with, and that has taken me to very different places, had very different conversations, and I don't think that somehow can be an assumed way of how you relate to your next project or your next endeavor. And that's why I put a strong emphasis on a project-based way of thinking about things rather than a kind of, you know, we have a tendency of thinking about methods or systems in a kind of way that's being applied to problems. And I don't really believe that from this kind of top-down approach. I see it much more conversational. I don't know if that helps to at least contextualize at least the cybernetic aspect of the discussion.
I think that's really interesting, Theo, what you just say is in terms of approaching research, because traditionally we are taught, going through the PhD process, you do methods, you need to produce significance, your things need to have implication, have an impact, right? So these are almost keywords that are almost inscribed in any form of research. And we then go to design research, we then apply exactly the same framework around it. And I think Helene, in a way, is kind of started to suggest that in the panel earlier today. And I think you were saying, and I really like the last part of your talk when you said, well, I'm not apologetic about design, and design as a way of designing true projects, as a way of looking and inspecting at particular problems, spatially or materially. I thought that is actually super interesting, to place design back into the center of research again. And I think this is maybe a question that maybe we can bring Rokas into it, because your panel talks about making as a form of learning, right? And I think in Theo's projects, I think there's a very explicit terms where you go, well, everything's computationally simulated and everything is feasible computationally, but what is not feasible and the nuances are always within the physicals in bringing out of the digital environments. But then to still have that sort of accuracy. Leda, do you want to talk a little bit about Rokas, do you want to?
Yeah. So I think what I found most compelling in your presentation was, and that brings me back to the start of the day and indigenous knowledge, the mode of sharing and the conversation. So, and you gave us insights in how you think and how you practice, and not holding back because of some IP rights or giving too much away, or holding on to your own knowledge. So it's like this mode of generosity. And in terms of the making and how you invite students to have a voice, which is also very much indigenous practice of like inviting everyone into the conversation and not having a very much hierarchical. You might know more because you have more experience, but it doesn't mean that someone who hasn't got that experience doesn't have anything to say. So I think, I resonated really a lot with when you talked about how you work and how you invite students, and you talk about a framework. So I think the making is one part of that. For me, reflecting on the day and the conversations we had and the lectures we heard, I actually thought the key to education and research is keeping and holding on to and generating and fostering curiosity. Like this way of not knowing but wanting to know more, exploring and taking the risk, reflecting but also producing and failing. So it's kind of this engagement in the world, not being in your silo, being open to difficult questions, collaborating without knowing what the outcome's going to be, being questioned on what you know by others because they might have a different opinion. So, what we also describe as discourse and exchange. So I think, it's more like the framework and the attitude we have to things, how we do them, rather than what we're actually doing. Because if we reflect on what we're doing, we're just going to do the same again, what we've done before, because it makes us feel safe. So I think that's where I really enjoyed, and had many connections with many things I didn't understand, but that wasn't important. It was more about like seeing that curiosity and playfulness and generosity of sharing and inviting. And I think for me, I had so many keywords, and at the end I'm going, curiosity. Fostering it, that students really want to explore. Keeping it as you might have had it as a child, but continue to be curious without worrying about the risk, the failure, the institution, the assessment through frameworks and so forth. It's just like going, I don't care. I want to know this. I want to explore this.
I think it's important to say that, at least from my perspective, something that has creeped in over the years is also to safeguard that space. Institutions seem to encroach on the idea that search is needs to have a metric that's attached to a certain way of validating the kinds of questions we explore. And I think the only thing that I can somehow wholeheartedly kind of speak to is time. We need time to ask questions, to explore things. And I think as an educator anyway, at least directing the DRL, and even in a context like the AA, it has always been to, in some sense, safeguard its place, like for people to feel like it's a space that they can explore stuff. Even if we talk about a lot of these practices, people always move towards a kind of optimization of deliverables, you know, people getting PhDs in like 3 years, it took me 10. The conversation about all of this kind of stuff is really about, for me, trying to, you know, try to be something positive in the world that says that this stuff matters, that it matters because you think it matters, because you see that you have the capacity and agency to engage, but it also challenges you. And that's a space that necessitates, I think, an understanding, because it's, I mean, it can be social drama, you know, it could be reality TV in the lab sometimes too. We somehow have to challenge our own orthodoxies, how we relate to people, how we relate to things. But I think the more that people can understand that, and that's where I think the role of people that work on this stuff is really important, to demystify it. And that's where I think people who are practitioners in this way, and I think Jenny spoke to it yesterday as well in a form, it's kind of giving people a way to see like, okay, this is a model of somebody who's tried and this was their path. I'm not interested in them following my path, but I'm interested in them to create their own path. And the only way to meaningfully do that is to be exposed to things and bring themselves into the discussion and also be committed to something. This is where I think like discourse on its own without a commitment to that discourse, I think is sometimes something that academia becomes a bit too academic for me. And maybe I purposefully have tried to keep myself in environments that I think I can leverage that belief that students come that isn't really burdened by all of the reasons that somehow people think on the outside world is going to somehow stifle creativity. All the students that come to me are already architects. I'm not teaching them architecture. I'm working with them to think about how we can kind of expand the implications of that for many, many difficult and challenging problems that they, for sure, co-author in any form of practice through what they do. And I think that that's very important. The project is bigger than me. Idea of research is not qualified to a piece of work. It's, you know, we try to create a framework over 3 or 4 years. And then I think that that allows a certain moment of reflection and ability to kind of evolve and to mature the kinds of questions we're asking in a meaningful way that's also accessible to the students because they are working in that. But I have to say that my studio, I wouldn't call it an office, I'm not very good at, as you rightfully pointed out, I don't believe in IP in that sense. I think ideas and innovation have to be shared if we're going to do that. I also recognize a lot of the challenges that people have, if they come to me or not. I couldn't afford to come to the school that I studied in now. And many of the people that I value are coming from very, very different backgrounds, and that's only a resource, I think, to really address some of these problems. I think some of the things you said, obviously we share.
I think
Really
I'm going
dying
to
to
follow a little bit
ask.
on this. Oh, you wanted to go first?
I just had this question that was sort of really bouncing around in my head. You know, watching you describe all the projects, many projects, a lot of kind of labour there, and then the work with the students. And but a few thoughts were kind of connecting in my brain. And also my son was sitting next to me earlier, so he was making some really interesting observations too, from the point of view of a 14-and-a-half-year-old. So And I might not get this quite right because you'll have to correct me. I am no expert in either first or second order cybernetics and the history that you've outlaid for us. You know, I want the book that pieces all these things together. I think it's, you know, it is very fascinating, that history. Personally, I like Gregory Bateson. He's my man, but whatever. But okay, if it's okay, I just want to kind of track back through a few thoughts. The environment is a technological system or can be conceptualized as such. The work that you're doing, as you said early on, is like getting out of the computer, where we've been experimenting for a long time with self-organizing systems, you know, the love of slime mold that came in early on and how he modeled it, and bringing it into the world through these various models, also exploring that collaboratively with students. And then my son and I earlier on are sitting there. So then where is, okay, now I'm kind of looking for the cautionary tale aspect of the adventures here and the flourishing of the creative work that happens collaboratively and, you know, so furiously in its sort of productivity. Florian and I are sitting there and we're watching an image on a screen. There's a woman in a room, and around her a box is drawn with the word target next to it. In the room, there's also a translucent bubble that's hovering around, and every time she moves, the bubble follows her. And at the same moment, before, you know, I was thinking it in my head, and then Florian said to me, oh, what if there was a bomb in the bubble, and the bubble's been trained to follow the target, which is the girl? Like, suddenly you realise in all of this kind of fabulous inventiveness and all of this experimentation, the ever-present risks of instrumentalisation, industrialisation, weaponisation in the logics. And we've seen it before again and again in the way that certain technologies get taken to places that we had not expected, where in fact our original intention is taken entirely astray. And I was really, you know, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Your son's name's Florian.
Sorry?
Your son's name's
Florian.
He's not here.
No, I know him, but he left, yeah.
Okay,
I can
so
report back to him.
I can send him a note. I mean, there's two things, and I'm thankful that he was in the audience because I think it's a really important subject, but I'll point two things out. One is, once technologies exist, they don't go back in the box. So the question is not how do we put them back in the box, but how can we explore this and how can we utilize it? And in the picture, or the video, the videos before, and I apologize if I didn't communicate this for Florian well enough. It's a conversation. She's communicating through a brainwave device. So in a sense, she's communicating with the sphere. The sphere is not just following her like a target. The sphere is in dialogue with her through her ability to call it. And I think those distinctions are very important because the world that Florian is afraid of exists. And it doesn't take much to turn on the television to understand that that world, or probably the one that you try to shelter him from, and I would as well if I was a parent, is every day, is all around us. And so I feel like the possibility of having a different kind of engagement, and I don't really talk about technology that much. I only did it here in the context because we were talking about education, and I think I have to kind of qualify some of the things in a school where there's architecture students and others and may feel that, you know, we have a lot of resources or we have experts in comp sci doing this stuff. We don't. We're sort of hacking things and learning and trying to do that. But the purpose of that is always motivated to somehow embrace the complexity of what if. And that's something that I think I learned with a lot of these kind of thought experiments that people were talking about. Bateson spoke to some of this, I think, as well. But those characters in particular were also not looking at control from a military American perspective. It was much more the British side of cybernetics that were really trying to understand brain and trying to understand communication and how things work. So somebody like Walter Gray Walter, he's a doctor, but he made the first kind of agent-based robots, these tortoises, that took the name from Alice in Wonderland, you know, as a mechanism to talk about simple interconnected systems could exhibit behavior. And you know, the title of the book that Paul was mentioning is trying to make the argument that if we try to understand things through behaviors, without the orthodoxy of human, non-human, post-human, all of these kind of things, that we may discover maybe different terms of engagement to be able to relate to things. And I think the fact, like the petting zoo project, we always put it literally like outside the gallery in the Barbican, wanted it to make sure that our contribution would be something that was public, you don't have to pay for, there's no ritual, it's really something that over time actually was very natural to the space. And that's where I think, regardless if it looks like tentacles or whatever the media wrote about it, the reality of that stuff is that people are very adaptive, and they are the adaptive component in the systems that we work with. But it leverages the fact that the human contribution, I think, is very important. So unlike slime mold and other things, the human intelligence is something that has to be somehow enabled. So it's not treating it as a kind of on-off thing, or, you know, search for food, don't find food, die. You know, like slime mold are intelligent, but I don't want to live in a world where slime mold somehow dictates the way that I operate in it. So I'm only mentioning that because I think Florian's point is very important. When people look at this stuff, they think that I'm interested in robotics, and my students the same, and I tell them I have zero interest in robotics. But when you move into a space where certain questions open up, you start to absorb, I think, a lot of kind of things that are a byproduct of it that are actually fundamental. And you either choose to acknowledge it or not. And I've spent the last 12 years of my life really focused on concepts of modular robotics and things that are really not in any way, shape, or form a part of the architectural discourse, but they emerge from a certain attitude of even just saying like a brick could move or something has agency. You enter in a very different domain, and you have to somehow explore it to, that's where the unknown is. It's not unknown like, what am I going to do today? As soon as I make one move, actually, that world of possibilities closes very quickly, and you have to respond. And I think that always means that you have a very active engagement, and you have to find mechanisms to be motivated. And that's where I think making has that much more intuitive form of intelligence that we don't really speak to very much, but I feel is fundamental.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm really interested in the kind of idea of intuition and the role of students in the way that they're participating in some of this design. And I guess, in some of the ways that you're talking about this, the idea of frameworks and systems that might be operated on from the inside, and the frictions that come with that, and the conversations that sit within that necessarily imply some direction. And so the thing for me that sits underneath that is, I guess, how values might be explored in that space, and what students might bring and take from those kinds of conversations. I mean, I'm interested in those in some of the, I'm going to say that they're closed systems because they're bounded, but then the memory cloud one seemed like one that invited values from outside, and I'm wondering whether that was why the press seemed to say it was so outrageous. That got me all intrigued.
I mean, I think that the difference is projects like Memory Cloud and a lot of this, I mean, these are long-standing discussions with my brother. I mean, I don't purposefully make a distinction between my work and the work of the lab, not because I think that it's all my work, but I see it really as very different sensibilities and sensitivities. With working with my brother, communication is really the things we foregrounded, and to the point that Elaine mentioned about studying in discipline. For a very long time, I was never architect enough for the architects and never artist enough for the artists, and I have to say that I never cared. And I think that's very important because in some ways, I think there has to be a certain integrity in terms of the way that you're working on things, because it's not glamorous. It's very hard work. It's after hours, after a job. What motivates you to do that? And sometimes I think my students can be very well-meaning, but can also be very naive to think that just because they want something, that it's in front of them and they can have it without sacrificing other things. And I think that's where I very much value generosity, because when people kind of open the door, it doesn't mean that you're going to walk through, but you have the possibility of doing that. And if you know that and you've encountered interactions with people that have kind of changed your thoughts on things, you know how rare that is, but how impactful, and you make decisions that have implications that really amplify with a certain magnitude, which you can't really understand. And maybe when you really truly understand, maybe, time's up. But the reality of it is, I think that the process of it, it's really all process, no end. And I think that that's very important. So these projects, I mentioned it in a kind of paraphrased way, but there was a book on sculpture that I got when I was young by one of my teachers in Newark. It's Robert Morris's Collective History of Sculpture, which he also included himself. And he titled it A Continuous Project Altered Daily. And I just thought that the title was, mind-blowing. I don't know why, because actually all of our projects, they don't actually have a finality. They've just come to a certain state. And sometimes we pick that up in different forms, and sometimes, they lay dormant. But they're ideas, and the ideas will find different forms. And that's where I think response to context matters. These are not applied systems with some kind of generic idea of prototype. I speak about the prototypical as a way to be really context responsive, and that's why I try to approach it from a frameworks perspective. And Pask basically said that cybernetics was really the natural theory of architecture that had anything to do with complexity. You could agree with him or not, but his idea of cybernetics I can kind of understand. And my PhD supervisor spoke about design as a circular activity. You could have a conversation with yourself through drawing or through whatever. It's not necessarily with human engagement, or even with yourself, could be with non-human actors. And it had a very particular resonance because it just made everything into something that was curious and that challenged any kind of thought process that I may have in terms of what that would mean. So if you allow yourself that kind of thought experiment approach, I think it has a lot of value, because you basically work through very different kind of vantage points, and I think that makes you also more receptive to other people's vantage points. It doesn't sort of reinforce just a way of seeing it. It says that everybody's way of seeing is different. And you kind of celebrate that, because in some sense you see the power of that difference as something that has resonance. And that's something that at least I feel is a powerful thing, and probably meaningful today in more ways than one could express.
And if everybody is having a circular conversation with themselves, are there things that make that conversation faster or slower? And do they relate to value or personhood in some way?
Yeah, you mentioned values, and I think we always try to say, coming from like a good person approach, that at the end of the day, whatever it is, we're going to come out of it with shared values. Values don't always work that way. They don't always resolve themselves in a way that everybody has equal agreement in things. But I think it does somehow make that the goal. And I think as long as that's the goal, then there's a certain integrity to those differences that allows us to somehow interrogate them further. And I think you're right, we don't always resolve that at that moment in time, but as long as we allow that process to continue and don't close the conversation, then the possibility remains open. So I think in a lot of ways we don't celebrate not knowing. We are very reluctant to be a specialist and say that we don't know something. But the reality is that everything is really kind of unknown, and we have a very, very limited form of knowledge. And I mean, the people that leverage that, they do that for very different reasons. Some are very lucrative, some are self-serving. Some of them are just because people are afraid. And I think that we can remove some of that by actually just being more exposed about the way that we work on stuff. And I think that allows other people maybe just to see it for what it is and take from it what they want, or what they can, actually. Maybe they like the stuff I do, they hate it. Reality is, I'm going to keep doing what I do, you do what you do. And I think if there's a moment of engagement, that's great. From our side, we see that embedded in our form of practice, and we try to share it in a way to maybe potentially kind of open up that in a more meaningful way to other people, and to say that, okay, nobody comes to us knowing what we do holistically, actually, because each project is very different. They come to us from, oh, he's a robot guy, or, oh, he's the artist, or did an interview, whatever. It's usually one project and that's it. You know, they don't think Memory Cloud is the same value system as Petting Zoo, because they focus on the mechanical stuff or the atmospheric light stuff. And at the end of the day, those are mediums to you know, in some case, create voice or interaction or dialogue.
Thank you. I'm gonna follow up a little bit on the conversation that is going on, but bring it back to something that Paul started, being today the day dedicated to design research and education. There has been extremely interesting points made around design research through different lenses. Helene, in your panel, there were, you started the conversation about how we could perhaps use design research to influence pedagogy, or how could we rethink our pedagogy through the lens of design research. We have one extreme, like is the case of the AA, where design research is everywhere. You don't have to even talk about it. It's already there from early in the undergrad all the way to the master's level that you have been presenting. To the reference that you made, Paul, that you find in certain institutions is only when you are about to enter your PhD that you are asked to take certain courses on research methodology, ethics, et cetera, et cetera. And my question is for everyone here. First, how can we, again, rethink our pedagogy through the lens of design research? When do we bring design research into the equation, or at what level of our pedagogy? Is undergrad too early for some people? Is master's still too early? When does design research come into the equation in our pedagogy, basically? Yeah, or could be part of our pedagogy, yeah.
I mean, these are especially relevant questions for our institution, and, you know, for the pathway of architecture running from undergraduate through to the graduate school, as we're grappling with how best to sort of frame what is a master's thesis, whether the master's thesis as a final semester needs before it a course dedicated to research, which makes the assumption that we haven't already been undertaking that search from the very beginning. And if we haven't been undertaking that search from year one, then we're not doing something right. So if there isn't a suggestion of some form of, you know, generous, open-ended research as a form of searching with our teachers alongside them collaboratively from day one, and if we only think to add it like in that second to final semester to support finally a moment when you can undertake design research inside your master's thesis, then design pedagogy is kind of gone askew. And this does make me wonder about, you know, how do we foster those pedagogical spaces of indisciplination where the teacher is prepared to acknowledge their lack of knowledge and that they are learning too, and prepared to be so vulnerable, prepared to give up authority, prepared to understand that each person gathered in that design studio or other workshop, pedagogical environment, you know, have something valid to bring to the table, have their own embodied knowledge, have their own kind of history of understanding the world. Surely that's got to be there from day one. And Kate's our educational expert. Maybe we can throw this at her. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay, let's do that then. The
Instead of what?
yeah. I mean, I think these are clearly really important questions. I think part of the challenge of it is making space for those. You know, you can't. They don't fit in a box. They don't. You can't tick. You can't. You know, you can't list them out. At the same time, they need to be employed and they need to be collected around. Are they focus points? Are there moments throughout the opportunities that we offer to our students that recognise how they are travelling through their time with us, which is not linear and which is not additive, but that allow us to unpack those spaces with them and allow them to guide that conversation. And I'm kind of censoring myself on the inside right now because I'm kind of saying us and them, which is clearly flawed. However, I think that we do necessarily need to engage in these spaces, and I do think for our institution some of that challenge has to do with the scale of the number of people that we're talking to, but every student is a person and therefore has a singular and valuable perspective, and I think that we need to find ways to allow that to flourish, and we need to find ways to allow that to make a real impact on what we're doing and the conversations that develop collectively.
Can I add a different perspective? Because I think, I guess I'm slightly privileged that I'm now head of school of a very small school. And I feel, I mean, I agree with Helene, what you were saying. I think undergraduate needs to start research, and I think that's really, really important. And in fact, Donald Bakes has just put in a statement in Slido on this, and I think, but that search at some point needs to develop into, I think, what Leda was talking about, and this is where the AA, as a school, thrives on, is a change in pedagogical models where we don't teach students within a very defined framework of 12 weeks, which is typically our semesters in Australia, how we would then teach methodologies through the final products. And I think the freedoms, the elasticities that one needs to give to the students, really in this sort of design research models within the studio culture needs to be radically challenged in Australian education, higher education, especially in architecture studios teaching. And I'm not trying to sell the school, but in a way, what I notice a vast difference is when you engage with students instead of on a 3 hours per week level to a 9 hours for studios. You give students space, and I think there's a conversations even when I was at Melbourne School of Design about overloading students and giving students breathing space. And I thought that was a really poignant things to kind of capture and go, how do we give students breathing space to do design research and not just to do productions? And I think that's, I think it's a particular problems in Australian education. I think in the UK, the education systems are much, I guess it's a year-long system, so it's much more, you have more space, more room. But the centrality of design within architecture educations, I think needs to be bring to the surface. And I think it's just, I think Kate's make a really good point, scale and also time. It's really difficult to handle within this context. Kate?
Yeah, time and space. I mean, it's also, I guess, one of the things that I'm thinking about, a challenge that sits in the way that you're putting it, is how do we conceptualise design research for an undergrad student, and how do we compare that with production? Because surely the production of some of the beautiful things that we've been seeing tonight, the making of that is the exploration. And I wonder whether, in some ways, it's the tenor of our conversation that can open up some of those spaces. I mean, is there a space in there where we can actually talk about production as a space of exploration as well? And can we talk about our teaching as a space of exploration as well?
That's what Rockus was drawing attention to just in his earlier panel, no?
God, don't get me started. But no, I think I want to have a little gradient in there. So I think there is something where design research becomes really something else than designing. But you can't do design research if you never gave a student from day one agency in their designing process. So it's about attitude. So creating space in terms of creating space for them to actually start thinking what they're interested in and what they want to get out of it beyond a certificate. So, and it's, my problem is that we're, by trying to control or manage or whatever we want to call it, large student numbers, we're trying to implement a system where we control that thing which is strangling every student when they start, which is continuing as an education from high school, where I think I have to uneducate them how they started understanding what learning means. And that problem is that what you describe as searching for something and that engagement and agency, but I wouldn't say that that is design research, but it's the starting point to actually develop an agency, which then leads to a point where you become more independent and you can actually pose your own questions, and you are enabled through education to undertake design research, which then grows into something else. But the thing is, we start in the last task of a master year to ask the question, what is it, what you you're interested in? Too late. Excuse my French. So it's too late. That's my problem. We are starting too late to give them the liberty to explore. Because when I started here, it was like, oh, what is it what I have to do? And I'm going, start thinking and tell me what you want to do. So, and that's more the thing we should do. At the same time, we have to teach them knowledge and you know, skills and things, but you don't teach them by saying this is the skill you need. You teach them by them wanting to learn something, and then they, in that process, develop those skills, and they do things they have no idea about, and they do things I have no idea about, but they collect it together, and they get it somewhere else. They don't get it by us, by spoon feeding. We can't spoon feed every knowledge you need, because we don't have the time, and we don't have the space. But it's also not the process. It's also not the process how you learn. I mean, that's the whole thing you talk about, I think. You know, it's not the process how you learn that you say, this is how you do things. No, no. Create that space to be curious, to start learning, to exploring, to take risks, to tell me what you're interested in, and go off and do something totally else. I'm not interested in educating architects. I'm interested in educating people in how to learn and what they, you know, what their trajectory could be. And I'm proud that some of my students are doing something totally different than architecture. They go into film, they go into many, many other ways. And they go, I'm not going to even, I go sail around the world, you know? And then I'm going, great, you know? You're taking your life in your hands and you're saying, this is what I want to do. And they engage in activism, or they become politicized. So they, you know, they're part of society, and that's what we should educate. And it's not a service we're providing, it's an education. Oh, see, you should not get me started.
No, that's great.
Perhaps something that you refer to in the lecture several times is the idea of failure, fail and fail again, and you said it, is something that perhaps we don't encourage students enough, that they learn through failing. And perhaps it's because of the time aspect that you were mentioning about the 12-week studio, that they feel they have the rush that they cannot fail. They have to just keep going with whatever happens. But how do we inject that, in a way, I wouldn't say passion for failure, but understanding that you do learn through failure, that failure is okay. I mean, it's part of the learning and the research process. Otherwise, what are you learning if it's right from the first attempt, basically?
Failure's been a recurring theme today, which I think is really exciting. And I think we should give Beckett his due, because like earlier in the day I wrote it down out of Worstwood Ho. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Which I wrote down.
Thank you, Helene, for connecting the start of the day to the end of the day. We've done it.
I think I need to qualify failure slightly. I can say that failure is part of a process of kind of trying to discover, I think, let's call it more informed questions. So like, for example, with me and Stephen, we may not, failure is such a process of things, but if you asked us if we believe in failure, absolutely not. Things have to work. You know, somebody that's coming to visit needs to experience it without that as being somehow embedded in the conversation. So to achieve that, you have to kind of open up yourself that you're going to fail 1,000 times, and that process is okay. But as soon as you somehow put something into the world, it's not like a get out of free jail card kind of thing. You have a responsibility. So my feeling to a lot of the things that you guys are mentioning, I think if it's just freedom without context, it's very debilitating for students. I think creativity within constraints, I think, are very, very important, because it really speaks to not problem solving, but almost like problematizing what it is that constraint is somehow creating as a form of friction to the way that somebody's approaching the problem. So I think when it comes to students, they have to benefit from really being exposed to things. That's why I think Jenny's practice, it's a model, but there's a difference if it's a model for something versus a model of something. I think, if we fit too much into the fact that we're teaching them a certain skill, and these obviously have the complexity of what it is we're talking about. There's some things, of course, you're trying to teach them because they're coming to learn something. Those are techniques. That may be how to code. Those could be something that is very, very specific in terms of what we're talking about. When we're talking about design, that has very specific, intentionality, which is not cause and effect that has that kind of linear relationship. And that's where I feel like even then, if you ask my students, they would say that they have no freedom. They work with other people, so in the beginning they have to kind of get over their own ego, and that's not the thing that's most important, what you feel. It's like you guys are collaborating together on a problem, and there's a lot of the individual in a collective, but it's a shift a little bit in terms of how one goes through that, and that takes some time to, I would say, unlearn today, which is potentially different 20 years ago. I could say that the AA has the spirit of some of that, but I think if we assume that all of the AA is this free space for discovery and search, that's a very dangerous thing. So I think assumptions in general are very problematic, because in some sense they try to generalize to the point that it's somehow easily able to be communicated. And I think we have to also challenge, that some of these things, particularly in these kind of disciplines, have a certain degree of complexity that needs to be maintained, and oversimplifying things is really like the enemy, because in some sense it allows not only no space to challenge oneself, but for sure is not going to rise up to the challenges that are in front of us. And so I think we may find comfort, well, I don't actually, I'm a very anxious character when it comes to things and trying stuff, because I feel like there's a necessity to be, in some sense, exploring stuff. Otherwise, we only reinforce habit, and that's not going to get us anywhere. Sorry for my...
I'm going to
dogmatic
take
response.
a question actually from the audience that I think is very pertinent in this, or very interesting as a follow-up with this conversation, that is more related to these disciplinary boundaries, basically, and when this, perhaps the reign for more cross-disciplinary experimentation can happen, and this design research. So it's from Don Bates. Let me get to it. I had it just here, and now it moved. Oh gosh, 1 second. Here. It is important to note the point Theo makes that the students going to DRL already have their professional degree and go to DRL for something beyond normative. Do you think the innovations we focus on today, no, sorry, I have it, done, it moved up and down. Here. If the DRL is an opportunity beyond the regular, the accredited, does this open the space for a search that is beyond institutional research?
Don mentioned over dinner last night that he was going to ask a challenging question, so I'm glad that I'm being put to the task. It's a kind of very particular thing, because I see first-year kids that come to the AA. In some sense, everything is new to them, and they have a certain freedom to explore things in ways that are quite novel. And that novelty that they find in that, I think, in some ways is very empowering. But the same challenges that they have, I find quite similar to my DRL students, because they may be coming with a certain education that says that architecture is this, and you're a professional because of this. But that doesn't necessarily fulfill them. And so the search for trying to explore what's beyond that is not to challenge the orthodoxy of building or to challenge architecture. It's really more about trying, or the desire to kind of find something new, something that they can relate to, something that actually, that potentially forces them to unlearn the kind of professional aspect of what they're doing, and probably put them in a position to honestly try to discover what architecture can be. So I don't really believe in experimentation for the sake of experimentation. And sometimes some of the most normative problems of the day become the most challenging because they're so everyday that they actually demand a certain kind of radicality to engage. And that also goes in the way that these things are absorbed in the world. And maybe that's why we titled our book Enabling with my brother, because the purpose of it was much more about, people can be very passive or feel like there's a right and a wrong way to engage in things. And I'm not talking about extreme behaviors, I'm just talking about how they interact with themselves, how they engage in public space, how they communicate with each other, or if they communicate at all. And I feel like that divorce is amplified quite a lot through a lot of the new technologies, and we could talk even about the shared experiences of a pandemic and so forth. You would think that that would create a new common ground, but I think it basically necessitates even more efforts to communicate that it's, I get this thing like from some colleagues that I'm nostalgic to the things of the past. I have no interest in nostalgia at all, but I feel like there were certain kinds of questions that were asked that resonate to me much more than some of the questions being asked today. So we choose our friends and our enemies intellectually in some way to somehow create things, and that friction is probably more powerful when it goes against the grain, actually, of whatever it is that we're talking about. But I feel like it's important to kind of state that, because it's, once again, it's not a linear process. Knowledge is not like I'm smarter today than I was yesterday. It can work in the reverse. And that's why I think like Don's point is important, but I don't kind of want to somehow reinforce that the AA is such a special place. I believe it's a special place. That's why it's a special place. And that place would be anywhere that I would teach. And I think that that has to be how I approach these things. Otherwise, I would never be responsive to the context that I'm in. I would have a demand that the context somehow shapes me instead of me actually having a meaningful influence to the context. And I think that that changes that active participation, which I think is very important. And I'm only mentioning that as much as I love the AA. It's somehow taken for granted, and sometimes its own history is problematic to people, but for the wrong reasons. Instead of evolving something, we dismiss something, but we don't truly try to understand it. So that's too easy. And I think when things are really so easy, it becomes a very dangerous space because we're not really listening. And then I think if we don't listen, there's really no mechanism to somehow progress things.
Okay, I have a choice of two questions in my hand. One is going to stir up shit amongst you guys.
Then go for that one.
We can go for that one. The other one is practice related. Maybe we'll leave the practice. We only have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, so go for the first one.
All right, okay. This one is going to be controversial, and it's from Anonymous. Thank you, Anonymous. I like your... it says, many architectural lecturer has no teaching qualification. Is this a problem? Many architecture lecturer has no teaching qualification. Is this a problem?
This is a great question, actually. And of course, depending on where you're teaching and where you come from, you might or might not have been obliged to undertake a kind of teaching for a higher education course. For me, you know, I hadn't done that until I guess I'd been teaching for nearly 20 years already. Is that possible? Yeah, or at least...
Don't count.
Yeah, God. By the time I went to Stockholm and was obliged to do one of these courses, and of course, like everyone else in the room, it felt like I was being told how to suck eggs, and it was excruciating. It was an excruciating experience, and yet I'd have to grudgingly admit that I did take a lot away from it. But I think this goes back to how increasingly our institutions are being structured. I don't know whether it's the case at the AA, you might not have to do this, but most schools of architecture have course materials that comply with a certain kind of language, with a set of acronyms that meanwhile we all pretty well universally understand, from intended learning outcomes to teaching learning activities to the constructive alignment as outlined by Biggs and Tang in the textbook for higher education teaching. So we have all these instruments, and unfortunately they might have been designed with the best of intentions. They have been circulated pretty well globally. You find them at many, many schools of architecture. This is the way that teaching is organised as a contract between a teacher and a student. And yet, even though they're designed with the best intentions of being able to, communicate and share this knowledge, they risk becoming blunt because, well, most people don't understand what the acronyms are. They're obliged to use them because you have to fill in the handbook and you have to revise it every year. They don't introduce the terminology to students. They don't understand it themselves, and so unfortunately, I see the education I've received myself in how to become a university teacher as one that's rather about understanding the special language that we have to use. So rather than, what I prefer, and I think this is what Belt does a little bit more of, how do we workshop amongst our peers what we're doing, what's working for us, how do we learn from each other? So the moments we get to debrief with each other, or the spaces of sharing between ourselves as colleagues in a school, how do we build our own kind of collegiality in that way? How do we open ourselves to each other's kind of diverse experiments? So the sort of universal language I really balk at, even though I know it's embedded with the best of intentions. Most of us don't understand what it is, sadly, or not, I don't know. But we've been kind of overrun, and I just see this as an unfortunate way in which education has been instrumentalised. So we lose those spaces of indisciplination, of curiosity, of the space of dialogue between teacher and student, because everyone's so anxious to either kind of fill in the paperwork correctly, get the tick boxes lined up, make sure that every bit of kind of knowledge that's banked in the student's brain is able to be assessed by a quiz here or a box there. So this can be an unfortunate outcome of the formalisation of the education of university lecturers, but that's the negative take on it. I'm sure there are positive takes on it.
I'll go.
Yes, please.
I mean, I'll pick up half of your point, I think. I don't think it's important that everybody has a teaching qualification. I do think that education gives people freedom. And I do think it's important that we have rich and informed and creative conversations about how we teach and what we teach and why we teach and who we teach. I think they're really important conversations. And I don't think you need a bit of paper to be able to have the conversations, but I do think that we need to move beyond this great term that I read the other day, which was folk practice in teaching, this folk practice. So this kind of idea of inherited habits in our teaching practices that become a kind of accepted way of doing things and that never really get critiqued. And so I think that one of the benefits of engaging deeply with practice, and I think teaching should be creative, and I think teaching can be design, I think that there's a real opportunity there. But I don't think that that's a thing that can be done semi-consciously. I think it needs to be done consciously. If it works for some people to go to a course and to learn the language and to kind of understand the acronyms, great. If it works for other people to engage in collegiate conversations, to read a bunch of books, to go out to conferences and to be engaged in a different way of exploring their practice, that's great. At the end of the day, I think what we need to do is to equip ourselves to be able to engage creatively in those teaching practices and spaces of learning for ourselves as well as our students.
I agree. I think what part of the point around architecture education is because the education is so professionally orientated, especially at the master's level with accreditations, inevitably we need to be able to absorb professional practice knowledge. That means that I'm not talking about practitioners, but I'm partly talking about practitioners coming in to teach. I'm also talking about how we can create rooms for design research to occur within our education system, certainly at the master's level, where we already have enough institutional red tape and short courses, micro-credentials, whatever, to scaffold this sort of educated kind of guidance around how one would be able to navigate through kind of teaching formally, as Kate would call it, the folk teaching. But I think from the practitioner's point of view, the more we can engage with the industry as a discipline, as a profession, as educators, I think the students will benefit hugely from that, not just from a professional practice point of view. And this is my second question, which I'm trying to lead to, is about how some of this knowledge of experimentations, of design research, can start to trickle into practice. And I think that's one of the questions that comes from our audience, is about how do we allow space, how do we allow this sort of thinking to be transferred into practice so it doesn't just stop at the end of your master's program or the end of your postgraduate programs, right? Because there is always a fear that there's always a kind of sense of disconnection that educations are so experimental and practice are so conservative. So where do we go? Well, we stop at the fab lab, right? Digital fabrication stops at the fab lab. Digital fabrication doesn't travel into practice, but that's completely nonsense because Jenny, whose lectures yesterday, has already demonstrated the potential of the models to bring it into practice, to bring research into practice. I think that's kind of it's a great question, and I think it's really kind of stir out a lot of emotions because it's not about just bounding us to a teaching, let's say, standard. I think, of course, it's important, but within our education system, within architecture educations, how do we also give that latitudes for research and for design research? Theo, any?
Yeah, I need to ask, why did you think the qualifications question was going to be so controversial?
I didn't.
No, I think it needs to be expanded on, because in an academic environment that usually means degrees. And you're hinting at the fact, well, actually, there are people with degrees but no concept of practice. And I don't know, I try to take it very honestly from a personal perspective. I've never hired anybody based on their qualifications one way or the other. They help as a guideline for some initial interaction, but I'm very interested in what they do, and that somehow speaks a lot more to actually what it is that I'm also looking from them to contribute and to share with other people. And if I'm very, very honest, I got hired at the AA when I was 24. And if I had stayed in the States at NJIT in Newark, or I did my 5 years and whatever, I would never have been employed as an educator at that age. At the same time, like, I got hired as a job as an educator, but at any moment in time that could have been pulled from me a second, you know, like, there was no safety in that, and there was no desire to be a professional academic. It just seemed like a very important opportunity to work with people. So I really do think that people in the context are evaluating people. The way that they choose to do that can be much more human than others. I think the CV is an easy way to do that. But to be honest with you, everybody has a PhD these days, so I don't know if that means so much. At the same time, like, you know, I think it's very important to try to make the conversation a conversation institutionally. Because it's very easy. I mean, in Greece, you need a PhD to be an educator, but all educators really don't believe in practice. I'm making a gross generalization, but they haven't practiced.
And another point here I would add actually is that we can't make the assumption that well-known architects are good pedagogues, which is a mistake you see happening again and again. So it does go two ways a little bit. There's always the risk with the practitioner that they come in and they just want to sort of say, well, this is the way you practice, and they create that kind of cult.
It's true, but I also think that we always focus on the bad version of it. The good version, I remember when we were looking for a director of the AA, called chairman at that time, Zaha gave a talk and said that she thought it was very important for the AA to bring back the practitioner, because the kinds of problems that they're working on is not about fame or fortune, it's just different. And that is a meaningful contribution. Now I'm expanding. She was much more direct about the fact that everybody in the AA was just comfortable being academics. And it was a critique that I felt was very important and resonated, and it should have spoke more. I just mean, like, I don't know, there's a danger in trying to find an agreement on this when it's such a very highly specific thing. But it's for sure about the kind of knowledge that we think is important for our students, because you shape a pedagogy, you shape a curriculum. What kind of voices and how are they being instrumentalized also should speak to what possibilities do we really mean in terms of practice, because I'm totally okay with my students doing whatever they want afterwards. But while they're with me, we talk about architecture in a very expanded sense. And I'm happy that they go into all kinds of industries. And I think it's a positive thing, but it's a choice. So for the conversation about experimentation outside of school, I mean, things are difficult, they're tough. That's when real experimentation matters. That's where the integrity of actually what you want to do in the world is actually on you. So I don't really think that there are excuses for that. I think there are challenges that we all have to deal with. I can only try to share, and I think Jenny shared it, is that there's a wholehearted investment in something that has to be very personal. And that's where I think, like, the only thing that we could really do is share our experiences and make them somehow known, and not think of them as a model for something, but an opportunity for other people to see, like, this was our path, and I'm sure it will be different for them. But
Thank you. We are getting the warning signs to wrap up. We have a reflection from Don here that I think is a nice way to end, that refers to your lectures, the terms of the title of your lecture. It will seem that the remit of most educational systems is certainty. I will prefer to suggest that the role of an educator is to produce engaged uncertainty. So I think with that, maybe we conclude. Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion that we could keep going on, and I'm sure over dinner we can continue the discussion. But thank you very, very much. And I'll
It's
pass
my
it
task
yeah,
to wrap
that's-
up for today, but also for the symposium. I want to thank first of all the audience and encourage you, and this is addressed to our staff and our students, to be generous, engaged, and curious. A big thank you to the faculty. As you know, this is all faculty funded, but there's also a big thank you for the generous support to Robert Garland Treasurer Fellowship and the Creative Futures Design and Research Education Fund, our partner, Melbourne Graduate School of Education, Federation Square for hosting day 2 of the symposium in this Melbourne landmark. And I really, truly enjoyed being here, and I think we should always be here. And I thank the AV team here from Federation Square, all the members of the Advanced Digital Design Fabrication Research Hub for creating this program, because every member yesterday definitely was all chaired by members from the Research Hub, but also, of course, all chairs of today, and specifically our guests from Theodore Spyropoulos and Jenny Wu with their keynotes, and Carol Gossam and Lisa Crocott. I'd like to thank JD Production Management for guiding us through this process, specifically Olivia, Lam, and Angeline. And there's a special thank you for Rosanna Verde and production team. She never got tired of changing things the 5th time. Neither did Tim Powell Wright. And I'm not doing this just because it's like, at the end of each movie you want to show how big your bloody production team was. It's necessary to do it, and I really enjoyed doing it because it was a long journey to get here. And it's, the least you deserve for going this pathway with all of us. Last, but not at all least, I'd like to thank Paul and Larry, the 3 co-conveners, for pushing through, holding onto the flag. And you won't believe it, it was a little bit of work, and it started a year ago, but we made it work.
Same your way. Thank you, Rokus.
Thanks, Rokus.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Crosses onward and